Hello, everyone. My name is Keyshawn Dupuy, and I'm happy to welcome you back. And with that, I would like to take the time to announce our speakers for our third session. We have Leah Tresanecki, Product Marketing Manager for Cloud Product Marketing at Veeam, and Dave Russell, Vice President of Enterprise Strategy at Veeam. Leah and Dave, please take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Keyshawn. So once again, my name is Leah Tresanecki. I'm the Principal Product Marketing Manager for Public Cloud Solutions here at Veeam, specializing in Microsoft Azure solutions. And I'm joined today by Dave Russell. He is our Vice President of Enterprise Strategy. And I'll let Dave introduce himself in a second. But first, let's do a little bit of housekeeping and just talk a bit about what we're going to be discussing today. At Veeam, we have a very healthy culture of research and feedback. So Dave and I are going to be spending quite a bit of time today breaking down a few of the research reports that Veeam commissions each year around a host of different topics, but the two that we're going to focus on specifically today is ransomware focused and hybrid cloud data protection. I think it's always helpful to get that macro level view, especially for those of you in the audience who are just trying to figure out what sort of things can I grab onto to build a strategy from, because obviously those of us who have worked in IT for a long time know that IT rapidly changes more than almost any other industry. But I think in the last few years, there have been so many changes in the storage and data management space specifically. And a lot of the folks that Dave and I talk to on a day-to-day basis are really craving some sort of direction that they can feel confident in. So hopefully some of these macro trends that we'll show you all today will give you some kind of strong footing to grab hold to. And then we're going to shift gears a bit and talk specifically about protecting data that resides in the cloud specifically. And of course, when it comes to cloud storage, there's so many different directions that we could take talking about cloud, whether it be backup to the cloud, backup of software as a service, containers, disaster recovery and disaster recovery as a service to the cloud. There's so many different ways that we could really take this conversation, but we wanted to focus uniquely on data protection in the cloud, because I think from a security perspective, there's a lot of folks that we talk to on a day-to-day basis that we feel are leaving rocks unturned, so to speak. And so we really want to sound the call and signal to folks that if you have a significant cloud deployment, you really need to be thinking about having a confident recovery strategy in place that, of course, optimizes costs and help us meet our SLAs, but that you also have the confidence can be resilient in the face of any kind of cybersecurity attack. And in particular, speaking of that confidence, we wanted to spotlight one of the customers that we work really closely with, Ciox Health, and specifically one of our key stakeholders there is the Chief Information Security Officer, Robbie Hudak. And she really believes strongly that Veeam is a cornerstone of her cybersecurity strategy, especially as she operates in a truly multi-cloud environment. So we're going to be spending time talking a bit about her installation and how she feels like Veeam has really aligned beautifully to her overall comprehensive cybersecurity strategy. And then finally, we'll talk a bit about how you could build a resilient hybrid cloud architecture using Veeam. Because I'm the Microsoft Azure expert, we're going to spend a bit of time specifically looking at a hybrid installation of on-premises deployments plus Microsoft Azure. But a lot of the principles that I discussed here can also apply to AWS installations, Google Cloud installations, and I'll touch on some of the other kinds of clouds that we support, including VMware clouds, sovereign clouds that are running on VMware Cloud Director, and so much more. Certainly Veeam is a software-defined storage agnostic vendor, so we play in lots of places, which I think helps with that comprehensive security strategy. But with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Dave. He can introduce himself, and then we'll talk a bit more about our research posture here at Veeam and some of the interesting macro trends that we see happening in the industry. So Dave, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Leah, and thank you, everyone, for joining. What we want to do is just talk through some industry agnostic trends in research. By industry agnostic, what we mean is that Veeam commissions a third party to go out and anonymously ask certain questions on our flagship report called the Data Protection Trends Report. It's now 3 times over for the last 3 years, has been the largest ever research in the history of backup and recovery or availability. from that, then we sometimes find interesting things such as cloud protection and ransomware activities that we double click on with follow-on projects. But this first one is interesting because part of what we like with a little bit of our research is to understand in general what's going on. And so you don't have to certainly survey 4,200 different organizations in 28 different countries to recognize large trends. But we do that because we can then break things down by what vertical, what company size, what exact location someone may be doing business in. And these aren't Veeam customers. In fact, Veeam, any one of our surveys is metriced to never comprise more than 7% of our responses. So this first one's kind of interesting because when we think about hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, the reality is for most of us, we are that. We're about halfway, 47% hosting workloads in the cloud of some kind, and then back on premises, data centers not going away for most of us. It's a roughly even split, actually a little higher than many would assume, 28% physical servers, 25% virtual servers. That's where our production workloads are deployed. When we double-clicked then in our cloud protection trends research, 1,700 organizations in production in the cloud environment, what we see is it's kind of interesting. It's been said that there's a huge amount of lift and shift going on, and certainly some of that's happening. We see 70% of migrated from either on-prem physical or on-prem virtual. But Leah, I think what's interesting is almost a third, at 30%, are born in the cloud, net new workloads. So the cloud is not something that organizations are exploring. It is already very much happening today. But what we see, though, is that there is no such thing as the cloud, meaning it means many different things to many organizations, but also this notion of do you go just one way, unidirectionally into the cloud? And the answer is no. So here we're down to about almost 1,300 respondents that said the vast majority of them at 88% said they brought some workload back from the cloud on premises. The very interesting thing to double click on that, though, that 88%, when we asked why, those are the three green bars there, and you can see it totals up to more than 100% because some organizations actually brought things back or repatriated, relocated data for a couple of different reasons. But the highest, Leah, at 49% over on the right, was that was always the plan. It wasn't that going to the cloud in some manner disappointed them. The economics weren't what they thought. Their plan was always to develop in a cloud and run back in production. So I'd like to share that because it really makes the point that having data mobility, cloud mobility baked into your data management solution, your availability solution is really important. So a lot of reasons why cloud workloads may need to get protected. Unfortunately, you can't have a conversation for very long in this day and age without getting into a discussion around cyber. And just a couple weeks ago, we released a new research report on that, 1,200 organizations, what their lessons learned were from successfully getting attacked from a cyber perspective. Another industry agnostic piece of research. But when it comes to cloud, many people are believing that we really need to protect cloud-based workloads for cybersecurity reasons. The attack vector is significant there as it is on premises. So related to that, internal threats, malicious users, disgruntled employees represent an area of exposure. And then there's the things that we're used to over and above, say cybersecurity. It's compliance, whether that's internal or external requirements to persist data. The notion of someone accidentally deletes a file, that still happens more often than people probably want to admit. And then in some cases, they want better restore granularity, or they want elongated retention over and above what a cloud provider, whether that's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service, may be providing for them. So good kind of poster child for that. Leah, I like to say that Microsoft 365 is been one of the most interesting SaaS solutions in the market. And the reason, there's probably a few ways that you can try to make that argument, but one of the things that I think is very interesting about M365 is that we can do something with that data. Meaning, if we persist that data and for whatever reason we lose connectivity to Microsoft, or potentially Microsoft has some sort of an outage, we can actually go take a local copy of Outlook or a local copy of OneDrive, SharePoint, what have you, and do something immediately with that data. So here in our cloud protection trends, what we're seeing are two different personas. The software as a service administrator in green, and then the traditional backup administrator in kind of that yellow gold. And so we just asked them a simple question, what are your organization's primary reasons for backing up your M365 data? And you can see the two groups largely align reasonably well. They certainly do at the top. Interesting that cyber for both organizations or both persona types rises to the top, and compliance is right behind there. But then we start to see some things where the backup administrator in particular starts to want more granularity and restore capabilities. If you've ever tried to manually recover M365, you basically get more than you bargained for. You've got to bring the whole SharePoint farm back as but one example versus, say, just one element or object of that. And to be able to easily centralize restoration operations. And you can see down the list, it's the things that we're used to seeing in terms of retention or accidental deletion. And here again, it's interestingly, I think the backup admin is speaking loudest here as we go down this list, because they're the ones that are going to get that call or that help ticket or that instant message for a request for assistance when somebody needs something. But the part that I really liked, even though it shows a little lower on the list, was the bottom one, is be able to use an M365 protection solution as part of a data migration process. Now, the last little bit of myth busting we want to do is around containers. And containers, what we're seeing so far is they're starting to be deployed more often in cloud-hosted environment, but there's still certainly container deployments, Kubernetes on premises as well. But very interesting is when we just asked the simple question of almost 2,100 organizations around the world, what's your organization's adoption of containers? If we look at the boundary condition, only 1% said there's no plans involving containers. 92% said we're either running in production, which was over half, or 40% said we're not in production, but we're planning to. And then the balance of that, meaning the 8% that remain, they're not in deployment yet, but they're interested in that. So it's just, in my mind, quite amazing, because we've been hearing for the last few years that containers sound a lot like, say, VMware vSphere did in the, pick your time frame, 2008, 2009, when vSphere hypervisor really went from back office into much more production. We're already seeing that happen even faster with containerized environments. And amazingly, when 52% here, over 1,000 organizations said that they're in production. Now, a little bit of the myth busting sometimes associated with containers is this is really just the domain of very, very large enterprises. And this is the exact same data, just broken out by size of company in terms of their intentions. So we just segmented it into, on the left-hand bar there, less than 250 employees, the middle 250 to just under 1,000 employees, and then we just used IDC and Gartner's definition of enterprise, which is 1,000 or more employees. And probably no surprise, the larger companies are more likely to be in production or interested in going into production, but Leah, the trends aren't radically different. So containers are happening. I used to, when I was at Gartner many years ago, had a colleague who said, if you have developers, you already have containers in your environment. You just may not know about them yet. So that's part of what we want to do, is just raise awareness for many different things and many different reasons for protecting in different environments. But SaaS-based services like M365 container environments, certainly something to keep in mind as more production workloads get implemented in that manner. So back to the bad news, if you will, and I'd like to say, this is not being pessimistic. This is being realistic. And what we're seeing here from our research is 85% of thousands of organizations that we surveyed said they had at least one cyber attack in the last 12 months. Now, year over year, those numbers got worse. In the prior year, 24% said they were not attacked. 24% fell to 15% this year. And Leah, one of the things I always like to mention is, that 85% attack number is high, but that 15% not attacked may be artificially high in that the dwell period associated with a cyber event could be such that an organization's been compromised, but they don't know it yet. Or it's even possible that we were dealing with a larger multinational corporation. Somebody responded from Sydney, Australia, but they didn't have visibility into an attack, say, in London, England, so they answered negatively when, in fact, their organization was hit. Now, this is sort of the wait, it gets worse and worse. Well, on average, people are self-reporting that a cyber event compromised 45% of their production data. Think about that, Leah, 45% of your servers, of your applications, of your file shares were either deleted or encrypted after a successful attack. So almost half. 75% of organizations are saying that their backup repositories were affected during a ransomware attack. In fact, the number goes up even higher if we also include those that say my backup software was attacked, but I was able to fend that off. So pattern here, most of us are getting hit. In fact, the really bad news is 49% said they got hit 2 or 3 times in a 12-month period. Every time they got hit, on average, 45% of their data affected. And 3 out of 4 cases, the bad actors were able to do some or a great deal of harm to their backup repositories. So a little bit about Veeam. Yes, go. Jump in, Leah.
Yeah. If I can jump in for just a second. Quinn actually just posted a comment in the Q&A that I wanted to point out. He mentioned that he would think that the number 85% would be more like 100% are under attack and they don't know it, or their protection and mitigation systems are successfully thwarting those attacks. And I know we've spent a lot of time talking about the shyness, I guess you could say, of people that want to even respond to anonymous surveys about whether or not they've had some sort of ransomware attack. So I don't know if you wanted to speak to that assertion that it's probably 100%.
Yeah, I really think Quinn's onto something there. I mean, if you think about the anatomy of successful attack, it's really a cascading list of failures, of escapes that had to happen. Intrusion detection had to fail. An employee had to click on a phishing link. Just go on down the list, but multiple safeguards fell by the wayside. And just given the prevalence of this, it's very hard to believe that there are many organizations that aren't under attack in some manner. In fact, just last week, when we were at our conference, Veeam spoke with a service provider, and they were describing how in Canada, a petroleum company, attack successfully launched under them. They were able to recover 100% of their data they got back. They didn't pay the ransom, so happy Veeam customer there. But the reason I mention that, Lee, when they did the forensics, they determined that the bad actor was actually in place for 6+ months and just slowly biding their time using escalation privileges, moving laterally or horizontally around into systems. They were in no hurry to be able to run in, sort of a smash and grab. That wasn't what they were after. The dwell time was half a year. So I think Quinn's probably correct.
And it's play the long game, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because, literally the cost of doing an attack is very, very low. In fact, depending on how involved or how much risk you want, there in the dark web, from what I understand from some of the people we've spoken with, is that you can either go and hire someone You can just be part of a group that goes in and infiltrates, and then you sell that. In fact, you could sell it to multiple different organizations, or you could take sole delivery of launching the attack, dwelling, escalating privileges, and then asking for the ransom in its entirety. But this is a legitimate business. In fact, one of the most amazing stories that I heard that is a negotiator for the cyber activist group was basically talking to the negotiator for the actual data center team. And the comment was, I'm glad to be dealing with a professional. Let's get down to business. It really is a business. Okay, so a little bit on Veeam. Veeam's been around now for over 15 years. As of the most recent IDC market share, we are the sole number one provider in the world, been either tied for number one or number one for the last 3 of the 6 months publications, 450,000 customers. The part that I like to dwell on is really down below. In my opinion, Veeam is really unique in the exact same ISO image that I run on my Lenovo laptop is the exact same code that an organization over in Europe is using with one instance of Veeam to manage 20,000 different servers, 8 petabytes of data. And one of the largest chip manufacturers is actually taking a few instances of Veeam to protect 30 petabytes of data, but one of their largest deployments is 10 petabytes with one Veeam installation, one administrator. Leah, I love this slide. I'd love to have you kind of decompose. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we think about, obviously, the scale of what Dave just mentioned, Veeam is very powerful in its ability to be able to centrally manage and operate at scale, especially enterprise scale. But I think what's really facing a lot of organizations is data sprawl. This idea that you've got multiple data centers, you might have some edge devices that are of critical importance, certainly multiple cloud installations. The vast majority of the organizations that we speak with are not locked into one specific cloud vendor, especially because of merger and acquisition and any other kind of thing that can cause chaos on, what a sort of central infrastructure strategy can be. So at Veeam, we really try to think about that sort of worst case scenario, the idea that your data is living everywhere, that you don't necessarily know where all of your data resides. Dave mentioned earlier this idea of, do I even have developers? Well, if you have containers, you probably do. I think that's almost a shadow IT instance in a lot of cases that infrastructure is getting spun up. So having a solution that can give you the confidence that it can protect all of your things, that's a sort of an emotional response that we're hearing from backup administrators, infrastructure managers, DevOps, and certainly C-suite executives as well. They want the ability to know that regardless of where their data moves to, or if they uncover a new IT project that needs to be pulled into the sphere of control, that they can have some sort of recovery tool set in place that they can confidently use when they need it. Because the time to figure out if you have an answer isn't when you're under attack. It has to be a documented, confident, tested process. So here at Veeam, we really like to think about our stack as focused on native backup of different kinds of platforms. We started as a VMware-focused organization, and we have spent a considerable amount of our development cycles really expanding our platform support across enterprise databases, operating systems, software as a service environments, and now different kinds of cloud installations, both infrastructure as a service and platform as a service offerings. And then pulling all of that into one central sphere of control so that you can have scalable observability, that you have a kind of similar DNA of recovery across all of these kinds of installations. So we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about how Veeam really thinks about native protection and recovery and layered security But one topic in particular that we spend a lot of our time really thinking about is this concept of mobility. And Dave talked a lot about that earlier too, especially with some of those statistics that were in the beginning, is how are we thinking about movement to the cloud, exfiltration from the cloud, and how can Veeam, from an R&D perspective, support that kind of posture? Because that just is the reality of most of the organizations that we work with today. So what's really cool, I think, about what Veeam really holds as a central value of development is this concept of portable backups and portable licensing. So specifically, we have a unique file type called a VBK file, and it actually keeps that backup portable. So if you wanted to back up to the cloud, if you exfiltrated a production workload from the cloud, bringing it on premises, the backup can move along with it. So it's not locked into a specific type of storage. And the license moves with it. Veeam has something called a Veeam Universal License. So instead of needing to look at a SKU book that's 100 miles long and buying individual license keys for individual kinds of workloads, you can actually just buy a Veeam license, and it can protect your VMware installation that you have today and move with that workload if it refactors, reforms to the cloud without needing to buy an additional license. It's not easy to operate with this kind of posture. It's not easy to really take the time to bake portability into everything we do. But it's what we hear from our customers. It's what we hear from organizations like you all, that you don't want to have to jump through procurement steps. You don't want to have to be thinking about backup when you're looking at some sort of cloud migration, infiltration, or exfiltration process. And so that sort of culture of portability is super important. And you can only get that portability uniquely with backup. And so I wanted to talk a little bit for those who maybe don't spend all of their time in backup land to kind of break down what backup means to Veeam. Because especially when we're looking at cloud data protection, but even if we go back 10, 15 years and look at traditional storage data protection, so many folks have really said, oh, well, my storage vendor has snapshots and that's probably good enough for me. But the reality is it's leaving you vulnerable to security improvements. It's much more challenging to execute granular recoveries, and it's not going to offer that portability that you need. If you're just taking a snapshot of storage, that is a like-for-like concept. And that's especially true in the cloud. So for those of you who maybe have a kind of cloud engineer or architect role right now, or if you have folks like that reporting to you, this is maybe something that you've talked a little bit about, but probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about. Snapshots are important for a data management perspective, but we're really challenging organizations to go beyond snapshotting and really thinking about the strategic value of backup. And that's because ultimately, when you have that backup, you unlock so much more capabilities that can align to a security strategy, that can give you the file level recovery that, you know, a platform as a service requires, or being able to execute so many of the things that DevOps requires in container land. Being able to recover more than just a snapshot is really important. And then, of course, that portability, to be able to back up to different clouds, to be able to back up to on-premises, to put something on tape. It's all possible with backup in a way that snapshots really can't execute. But specifically when it comes to security, because of course that's the major theme of today's summit, we wanted to talk a bit about how Veeam aligns to a comprehensive security strategy. Dave mentioned earlier a scenario of one of the organizations that Veeam supported in their recovery from a ransomware attack, that it was access that, you know, was part of that infiltration process. So with Veeam, we do integrate with all of the major identity and access management services that are in each of the cloud providers. For example, Azure Key Management, Azure Active Directory, and baked within all of the workflows is role-based access controls. So you can take a least privileged access posture. And when you look at, of course, any kind of security framework, whether it's NIST or any other kind of flavor, you'll see, of course, that identity and access management is one of the early kind of checks and balances that you want to take throughout your security planning. Veeam wants to align to that. We don't want to get in the way. Something that's kind of unique, though, that, again, a lot of folks who don't spend their time thinking about backup don't think about is the resiliency needed in your architecture. So with Veeam, what we actually have baked into the workflows for the cloud-native products is this concept of logical separation. So Dave and I are backup geeks, so I'll kind of go through a little bit of a one-on-one of what we mean with logical separation. If you were to look at backup of data center workloads, it is inherent that the backups would be on a separate media, right? You typically would have some sort of backup server that's dedicated for that process, and that way it doesn't impact compute and other functions that your production environment needs to operate in. But in the cloud, that inherent shared resource and the elasticity and all those things are no longer an issue. So people just kind of do whatever they need to do in those cloud work environments. And a lot of folks, especially those that are just using snapshots to protect their cloud workloads, are just scheduling those snapshots to live within the production subscriptions, within the production resource groups even. And so with Veeam, we actually have it baked into the workflows to show you how you can logically, with intention, separate your environment, to have a separate backup subscription, for example, to back up to a different availability zone, for example, to even back up to a different kind of storage. Why do you need to pay for production Azure VMs when you could back up to Azure Archive for a lot of these functions, and of course, save on your cloud bill as a result? So that logical separation bakes in a lot of resiliency that folks who maybe don't spend their time thinking about backup best practices like Dave and I do, it bakes it all in so that you don't have to spend the time to think about it, that those best practices are just a part of the workflows. And then finally, something we spent a lot of time working on as a product team over the last year or two is immutability and encryption. So encryption, of course, is baked in throughout the process, but we now have spent time with AWS, with Azure, to integrate with their immutable storage services. So with Azure, for example, we now support immutable storage for Azure Blob. And for those who don't know what immutability means, it's basically a write once, read many, or worm state technology, and it closes the door behind you. You back something up and you are unable to change that backup until the retention period has expired. And that is the safety net that so many organizations really need to implement. Because as Dave mentioned in his scenario, somebody was sitting there for 6 months, playing the long game, waiting for that opportunity to infiltrate. And when they did, that organization did not have to pay the ransom. They were able to recover backups that were locked in with that worm state to be able to recover confidently, knowing that ransomware hadn't infected that data. That's that safety net. That's that ripcord, the last step in that security framework that many organizations haven't implemented yet, or if they have, they've only done it for on-premises environments or for their tier 1 workloads. But being able to use something like immutable storage in the cloud makes it so much easier to be able to implement it for a lot more of your data. So you aren't looking at, as Dave showed earlier from those numbers, 45% of your data being infected, right? You can bring that number down without breaking the bank. So these are some of the key parts of our security story as an organization. I wanted to turn more to a micro level story and specifically talk about the relationship that we have with Robbie Hudak at Ciox Health. Robbie actually just last week spoke at our annual user conference, Veeam On, about how her team, her security team, really thinks about Veeam as a strategic tool set in her overall security framework. And that's because their environment is highly multi-cloud. they have significant installations of both AWS and Azure. So being locked into some sort of point solution for each one of these kinds of environments and platforms is not going to get it done because she does not have time to have her team manage multiple different solutions in their different infrastructures. So to give you a lay of the land of SIOX, SIOX is a healthcare organization. They've gone through some recent acquisitions, so they've grown pretty significantly and have, as a result, a very heterogeneous environment. They have 17,000 hospitals and clinics around the United States, and 1 million requesters served with access to protected health information. So just think of the scale that her organization has to manage. And of course, in her role as the CISO, she's looking at these numbers and thinking that's a huge threat surface. That is so many opportunities for something to go wrong. And so specifically when it comes to what's been top of mind for her, she's looking specifically at 4 data centers with 2 major cloud installations, as I said, AWS and Azure, with significant merger and acquisition activity that they've had. There hasn't been a ton of consolidation because they've been rapidly moving so fast. And so she's just trying to wrap her arms around this heterogeneous environment and all of these different policies that are in place, especially looking at how old some of these technologies are and how different a lot of them are. So that's a lot of what's been top of mind for Robbie. And with Veeam, what she found was kind of these 5 main points. If she were to summarize that and have a conversation with you one-on-one, this is what you would hear. First, she was really passionate about standardization. And obviously for those who are maybe individual contributors who are on the call thinking about what you have right in front of you, operational efficiency and standardization sounds awful because that just means that you may have to square peg round hole, being told something by upper management. But I think when it comes to security specifically as a lens that we're thinking about, standardization has to be the goal, especially when she's looking at so many different data centers, that M&A experience that they've been going through in the last few years. Standardizing has to be the goal because it's never going to be complete. It's never going to be 100% standardized. But as long as that's the due north, I think it brings more and more under the sphere of control. Something else, of course, being in healthcare that's top of mind is meeting compliance requirements. And specifically being able to meet data residency requirements by kind of architecting a backup strategy that keeps everything where it needs to be is a really successful outcome that she's been able to find with Veeam. And then especially around immutable backups that are logically and physically separated from production with least privilege access controls. Her and her team has spent a significant amount of time trying to pull as many of those workloads in as possible to that immutable backup strategy. That all sounds expensive, but they've actually been able to optimize cost. They're actually spending less than $20,000 a month, backing up 500 terabytes daily across clouds. And what's really great about that is she's actually able to look at the Veeam dashboard and see exactly how much she's spending because there's built-in cost calculators to tell you exactly what the compute, traffic, and storage costs are. So she feels confident that this was a worthwhile investment, both time and software, because ultimately she's able to get these outcomes and feel like she's working with a partner that can future-proof her. Veeam is really committed to staying as portable and ready to handle the next challenge as possible. And a lot of that's because we are software-defined, storage agnostic. We are not an appliance-based vendor. So we're able to be ready for what's next. And certainly, I think Robbie and her team are thrilled to have that as part of their partnership with us. So if you two wanted to implement a similar kind of strategy that Robbie has implemented, this is not Robbie's environment. For those who don't know, whenever you do a customer reference story, we try to be very, very cautious about showing any actual infrastructure because, of course, that offers information to bad actors to be able to understand an environment. So this is not at all what SIOX's environment looks like. This is a sample architecture. But hopefully it'll give those of you on the line who spend a lot of time in cloud storage, it'll give you a little bit of a picture of what it might look like to architect a backup strategy with Veeam. So first, let's look at a production environment. As I said, I am the Microsoft Azure expert, so I get to plug Azure. And here on this architecture, you can see that we're looking at Azure VMs, Azure SQL databases, and Azure file shares, all operating potentially within one production subscription, but it actually could be several. Just for simplicity of the diagram, I kept it as one. With Veeam, you'll be able to logically separate that into a different backup subscription. And so this could be one backup subscription that's backing up to a different availability zone. It could be different sites within one availability zone, whatever makes sense for your unique installation. You're able to execute that effectively and tier those backups out to cheaper and cheaper storage. Noticing, of course, on this diagram that we have that fun little green lock function, that shows you that at every single stage, you can enable immutable storage as part of those workflows. So you're closing the door behind you at each step of the way. And then what's nice about that is you also have all of these workflows for restore. So if you wanted to execute a recovery effectively using Veeam, you can restore an entire VM, you could recover an individual file share, all using really simple workflows. That's especially helpful for anybody who's working with folks on their team who don't do storage on a day-to-day basis. You can give them those least privilege access. You can give them that self-service recovery without messing up anything that's in that unique environment. But for the sort of concept of hybrid cloud, right? Nobody is all in on cloud, as amazing as that would be. Everything actually connects back to Veeam Backup and Replication, which is our main kind of central console for all things data protection. So everything can connect back to Veeam Backup and Replication. From there, you could tier it out to a different cloud if you wanted to go cross-cloud from Azure to AWS, if you wanted to use one of our object storage partners like Wasabi, if you wanted to keep it on premises or back it up to tape. There's all sorts of options by connecting to that VBR console. And we also have a solution called Veeam One, which is our monitoring and reporting tool. So especially for security use cases, it is so helpful to get a monthly report that says, yes, these workloads can be recovered. Yes, you have immutable storage turned on each of these. And there's real-time alerts that pop up whenever there's some sort of failure or some sort of malicious activity that could be detected. It's all baked into that Veeam One environment. So with that, Dave, I wanted to bring you back in here and see if you had anything else that you wanted to add to anything we just talked about, or if you wanted to maybe showcase some more research that we have.
Yeah, and shout out Quinn, who said, I love the immutability features to prevent ransomware or tampering of backups. Let me know when you can apply immutability to my age. So we'll check with R&D on that. But yeah, if we just kind of take a couple other questions, I'll leave this slide up here. And Bob was asking about, is it safe to click some of the links? Good one, Bob. You can either select the QR code for some of this research, or we have the short URLs kind of in the turquoise there. The couple that we've highlighted thus far have been around the data protection trends, the largest research in the industry, the cloud protection trends there in the lower left. And then I alluded to, but very recently, we just published last week our ransomware trends for 2023. And one that we didn't really mention, but because I focused on M365, but we also have a Salesforce protection trends. And so with that, Leah, here's a question. Does Veeam require an appliance to be deployed?
Great question. It doesn't. So there's a lot of vendors in the space who are appliance-based, whether that means an appliance on premises or even having an appliance dedicated in the cloud in a software as a service model. It would be an easy button, frankly, for Veeam to have an appliance. And there have been many debates over the years of whether or not we should. But I think it's looking at where we are now in the industry, this is proof positive that being software-defined storage agnostic is the right approach, because it just makes it easier for us to operate and answer any kind of challenge that any organization we work with has. It keeps us agile, it keeps us portable, and it makes it so much easier for us to be able to respond to changes in storage trends like the rapid acceleration to the cloud that we've seen in just the last few years? So that's a great question from the audience. Just looking at some of the other questions I see here, Dave, do you want to talk a little bit about insider threats? I see that there's a question here about does Veeam support resiliency from insider threats, like if a terminated employee deletes production or backup data? Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, there's a few different methods that can be used. One is through the help of our service provider partners who actually have a dedicated solution called Veeam Cloud Connect with Insider Protection. So it's just a way to enforce multiple different authorization levels for any kind of a destructive act like removing backups, things of that nature. So if you do have a relationship through a service provider, that's one option. If you've deployed some of the capabilities yourself, we offer immutability like Leah was mentioning, and no one can go and change that for its specified amount of time. So even the administrator, if you quote unquote make a mistake, you're locked into that level of immutability by design, that there is no sort of go back mode associated with that. And then there's a number of things that we can do. You mentioned our analytics solution, Leah, Veeam One. We can also update and alert organizations of if something's changing. You know, if there's not something that's properly spec'd out or not in keeping with best practices. And the latest release of our flagship solution, Veeam Backup and Replication, we actually also installed or created a new best practices analyzer, initially just focused on cyber threats and doing things to remind people what they should do, such as turn on immutability, enable multi-factor authentication. So if I were to net that all out, whether you consume Veeam through a business partner, a provider, and would like to get another layer of protection, that's certainly available. Veeam natively within the solutions itself has immutability characteristics, as well as the ability to alert on when things may be changing or not looking like they're appropriately configured. See another one here, kind of an integration story as well. How does Veeam play or interact with identity and access management tools, Leah?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Veeam has been integrated with Microsoft Active Directory for a long time, but especially as we move into the cloud, it's been really important to integrate with the dedicated IAM solutions that are in each one of the cloud providers. So the way that will work is Veeam creates a dedicated integration, so you won't have to script APIs or anything to get connected. You won't have to do manual imports. You'll be able to just do that in the initial setup process. And that way, from managing that least privilege access posture, you're able to keep a lot of the login information up to date. And I think what's nice about that too is it gives you the ability to open up least privilege access to other folks in your team. We talked earlier about containers and talked about how there's different recovery scenarios for DevOps than there would be for someone who's maybe managing production workloads. So the really nice thing is you could open up just simple recovery to them and even have storage limits and things that would keep guardrails on a recovery scenario without giving them the ability to be able to, let's say, delete a backup. We were talking about insider threats earlier. So that's really important to know. And if anybody does have any specific IAM questions that they have, please feel free to post that in the chat, and we'd be happy to make sure that we connect with whatever platform you may have a specific question about. Let's see, Dave, did you see any other questions in here that we would maybe want to address?
I just see one with regards about is Veeam going to cost more than using the built-in backup tools my cloud provider offers? You know, maybe we both take that one. I'll give you first talking point on that, Leah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, again, what our research has found is that a lot of the cloud teams who, again, don't eat, sleep, and breathe backup like the nerds of us are, they end up scheduling snapshots and thinking that that is enough. some teams have started to implement what we call first-party backup tools. So with every kind of new storage that comes out, that storage vendor always bakes in some sort of backup tool. And it is good enough. It is V1. But oftentimes, just because something might be freeware, as in the case of AWS's backup tool, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the most cost-effective. And that's because there's a level of sophistication in the way that a dedicated third-party backup vendor like Veeam can handle compression and storage management, tiering things out to cheaper and cheaper object storage and archive tiers, being able to age out data, for example, automatically so that you're not all of a sudden recognizing that you've kept something for 5 years when you only needed to keep it for 1. Even being able to exfiltrate from the cloud and bring it to an even cheaper storage solution on premises. It gives you that ability to do so much more than something that's locked in to that dedicated storage type. So I would encourage you to kind of model it out and take a look. Veeam actually has cost calculators that are built into the solution. So you're able to play this scenario out for yourself and see how much your cost savings could actually be. Or you could even take a look at the example that I showed earlier from Ciox Health, which was a significant installation, and they were able to keep their cloud bill pretty low. So I think it's definitely, cost is something that you could take off the table as a purchasing consideration pretty quickly.
Well, brilliantly, I have nothing to add to that. That was a super comprehensive answer. Fully agree with all that. As we begin to kind of wrap up now, want to just encourage, whoops, I went too there. I did go to the right spot. Just want to encourage Kishana to come back in. I think we've got a prize to give away in the last couple of minutes, if I'm not mistaken.
We do. Woo. Thank you so much for the lovely presentation and for tackling everyone's questions. I would like to remind the attendees that if you have more questions, please continue to put them into the Q&A box, and I will be sure to pass them on to Leah, Dave, and the Veeam team for them to directly get back to you. But yeah, thank you so much to Leah, Dave. I really appreciate your time today.